Carl Jung first introduced the concept of the shadow in his 1912 work, Psychology of the Unconscious. He wasn't developing theory for social media quotes or spiritual aesthetics. He was documenting clinical observations from treating patients with severe psychological splits, individuals whose repressed material was creating symptoms, compulsions, and destructive patterns. In his 1934 essay, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, Jung defined the shadow as the thing a person has no wish to be, the unconscious repository of repressed traits, emotions, and potentials that contradict our conscious self-image. But here's what contemporary content fundamentally misunderstands. Jung explicitly stated in his 1951 work, Ion, that the shadow is not inherently dark, evil, or feminine. He wrote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. The shadow contains whatever aspects of yourself you've rejected to develop your conscious persona." Jung observed that we develop our social identity by emphasizing certain traits while suppressing others. The suppressed material doesn't disappear, it forms what he called an autonomous complex in the unconscious. Yes, the shadow contains socially unacceptable traits: aggression, jealousy, manipulation. But Jung documented in his clinical notes that it also holds what he termed the golden shadow, positive qualities rejected because they didn't fit survival needs or family systems. In The Undiscovered Self, 1957, Jung wrote, "The shadow is merely somewhat inferior, primitive, unadapted, and awkward, not wholly bad." This contradicts the popular notion that shadow work means embracing darkness or destructive impulses. Jung's clinical method involved several documented stages, outlined in his 1961 work, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. First, recognizing projections. Jung observed that traits we strongly react to in others often reflect disowned aspects of ourselves. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Second, identifying emotional complexes. Jung documented that intense emotional reactions typically point to constellation, the activation of unconscious material around specific themes or triggers. Third, active imagination. In the Red Book, published posthumously, Jung detailed his method of dialoguing with unconscious figures through visualization and creative expression. This wasn't metaphor, it was clinical technique. Fourth, conscious integration. Jung emphasized in two essays on analytical psychology, 1928, that the goal isn't to become your shadow, but to develop what he called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing forces in creative tension. Jung wrote Man and His Symbols, 1964, "The shadow is a living part of the personality and therefore wants to live with it in some form. It cannot be argued out of existence or rationalized into harmlessness." This integration process, what Jung termed individuation, typically required years of therapeutic work. In his clinical observations, documented across decades of practice, Jung noted that attempting to rush this process often led to inflation, possession by unconscious contents, or what he called regressive restoration of the persona. The goal, as Jung wrote in The Development of Personality, 1954, was not to eliminate the shadow, but to withdraw projections and develop conscious choice about how to express the full range of human potential. This clinical framework reveals why popular interpretations miss the essential point. Shadow work isn't about expressing every impulse or letting your dark side out. It's about developing conscious relationship with previously rejected aspects of yourself. And this is where the confusion with dark feminine work becomes particularly problematic. The term dark feminine energy has no historical precedent in Jung's writings. It emerged from an entirely different intellectual tradition, one rooted in feminist philosophy. Goddess, Spirituality, and Cultural Criticism of Patriarchal Systems. Understanding its authentic origins requires examining several distinct but related movements. The mythological dimension draws from pre-Christian goddess traditions documented by scholars like Maria Gimbutas in The Language of the Goddess, 1989. These cultures honored complete feminine archetypes that included destruction alongside creation, sexuality alongside spirituality, fierce protection alongside nurturing care. Lilith, first mentioned in the medieval text, the Alphabet of Ben Sira, 8th–10th century, represents the archetype of feminine refusal to submit. Unlike Eve, created from Adam's rib, Lilith was formed from earth and claimed equality. When Adam demanded dominance, she spoke the ineffable name of God and flew away, becoming the first feminist in recorded literature. The Hindu goddess Kali, as described in the Devi Mahatmya, 5th–6th century CE, embodies time, change, and the power to destroy what no longer serves. Her dance, Shiva's chest, represents the dynamic feminine principle that activates static masculine consciousness. These weren't dark or evil deities, they were complete representations of life force that patriarchal systems later demonized to maintain control over feminine expression. The philosophical dimension emerged from 20th century feminist theory, particularly French feminist thought. Hélène Cixous, in The Laugh of the Medusa, 1975, wrote about l'écriture féminine, feminine writing that exists outside patriarchal linguistic structures. She argued that women's authentic expression had been systematically suppressed by male-dominated culture. Julia Kristeva, in Powers of Horror, 1980, introduced the concept of objection, how patriarchal systems don't just suppress the feminine, but actively cast it out as filth, pollution, or danger. Her work revealed how deeply embedded these patterns are in language and cultural structure. Lucy Irigaray, in This Sex, Which Is Not One, 1977, examined how women's sexuality has been defined entirely in relation to male pleasure and penetration, calling for a reclamation of autonomous feminine desire and embodiment. These weren't lifestyle philosophies, they were rigorous academic examinations of how patriarchal systems systematically suppress authentic feminine expression. The depth psychology dimension connects to Jung's animus theory, though it extends far beyond his original framework. Jung wrote in The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, 1928, "Every man carries within him the eternal image of woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definite feminine image." But later depth psychologists like Marion Woodman, in The Pregnant Virgin, 1985, examined how patriarchal conditioning creates specific wounds in women's psyche. The persecution of the wise woman through witch burnings, the silencing of authentic voice, the shaming of natural body wisdom, and the devaluation of feeling and intuition. The spiritual dimension reclaims goddess traditions documented by scholars like Gerda Lerner in The Creation of Patriarchy, 1986, showing how pre-agricultural societies honored feminine divinity as the source of life, death, and regeneration. When authentically understood, dark feminine energy represents several specific reclamation processes. Sexual sovereignty, what feminist theorist Audre Lorde called the erotic as power in her 1978 essay. This isn't about performing sexuality for others, but reclaiming erotic energy as a creative life force that belongs entirely to you. Emotional authenticity, the capacity to feel and express the full spectrum of human emotion without performing acceptable femininity. This includes what researcher Soraya Kemally documented in Rage Becomes Her, 2018, Women's Right to Anger as a Response to Injustice. Intuitive authority, what feminist epistemologist Belenky and colleagues called Women's Ways of Knowing in their 1986 study, showing how feminine ways of understanding complement but don't require validation from masculine rationality. Creative destruction, the capacity to end what no longer serves, documented in women's liberation literature as the right to leave relationships, situations, or identities that require diminishment. Fierce protection, what maternal researcher Sarah Ruddick called protective love in Maternal Thinking, 1989, the fierce capacity to defend what matters without apology. Cyclical wisdom, understanding documented by researchers like Miranda Gray in Red Moon, 1994, about women's natural connection to lunar and seasonal cycles, honoring rest and renewal as necessary for creation. This reclamation work addresses what feminist historian Gerda Lerner documented as the systematic devaluation of women's traditional sphere under patriarchal systems. But this cultural and spiritual reclamation is fundamentally different from Jung's individual psychological integration process, and conflating the two creates profound problems that actually impede both processes. When shadow work and dark feminine reclamation are merged without discernment, both processes become diluted and potentially harmful. The confusion creates what appears to be empowerment, but often manifests as spiritual bypassing, unprocessed trauma, or performing transformation rather than embodying it. Clinical psychologist John Wellwood, who coined the term spiritual bypassing in his 1984 work, Principles of Inner Work, defined it as using spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. This confusion manifests in several documented patterns. First, using spiritual concepts to avoid psychological responsibility. When someone justifies harmful behavior by claiming, "I'm just embracing my shadow," or "this is my dark feminine energy," they're often avoiding what Jung called the moral effort required for genuine integration. Jung explicitly warned in The Undiscovered Self, 1957, the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. He never suggested that recognizing shadow content meant acting it out without conscious choice. Second, performative empowerment that substitutes ascetic for genuine transformation. Social media posts about villain eras or dark goddess energy often reflect what psychologist Alice Miller documented in The Drama of the Gifted Child, 1979, as false self-presentation, performing power rather than developing it. Third, misunderstanding reactive emotions as empowered expression. Trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk documented in The Body Keeps the Score, 2014, how unprocessed trauma creates hypervigilance, emotional reactivity, and defensive patterns that survivors might mistake for strength. Chronic anger, reactivity, and emotional volatility are trauma responses that require therapeutic attention, not expressions of integrated feminine power. True empowerment, as documented in resilience research, involves increased emotional regulation, not decreased control. Fourth, conflating individual healing with collective liberation. Jung's shadow work addresses personal unconscious material, what he called the personal shadow, in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, 1959. Dark feminine reclamation addresses collective, cultural, and historical patterns that affect all women, regardless of individual psychology. Feminist theorist Bell Hooks wrote in All About Love, 2000, "Sometimes people try to destroy you precisely because they recognize your power. Understanding this collective dynamic helps differentiate between personal psychological work and cultural healing." Fifth, romanticizing trauma as empowerment. Trauma specialist Judith Herman documented in Trauma and Recovery, 1992, how survivors sometimes identify with their survival strategies, mistaking hypervigilance for intuition or emotional numbing for strength. But trauma responses, while protective and understandable, aren't the same as integrated power. Healing trauma often allows authentic feminine expression to emerge naturally, but the trauma itself isn't empowerment. Sixth, using mysticism to avoid practical accountability. Spiritual teacher Adyashanti wrote in The End of Your World, 2008. True spirituality is not about transcending the world, but about transforming our relationship to it. Authentic spiritual practice increases capacity for responsibility, not excuses for avoiding it. The most dangerous confusion involves mistaking intensity for depth or drama for transformation, creating chaos, shocking others, or expressing extreme emotions without conscious choice doesn't indicate integration. It often indicates the opposite. Research by emotion regulation specialist Marcia Linehan, documented in Cognitive Behavioral Treatment of Borderline Personality Disorder, 1993, shows that genuine emotional health involves the capacity to feel intensely without being controlled by those feelings. When these concepts are confused, people often become trapped in cycles of reactivity. While believing they're becoming more empowered, they mistake emotional volatility for authentic expression, justify harmful behavior as shadow work, and confuse being difficult with being powerful. This keeps them stuck in the very patterns they're trying to heal while believing they're making progress. The performance of transformation becomes a substitute for the genuine article. Authentic integration requires understanding what serves what purpose and approaching each process with appropriate methods and realistic timelines. Shadow work, as Jung documented across decades of clinical practice, is individual psychological integration. It involves examining projections, understanding emotional triggers, identifying autonomous complexes, and developing conscious choice about how to express your full human range. Jung wrote in The Practice of Psychotherapy, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This process requires what he called considerable moral effort, the willingness to face uncomfortable truths about your own patterns, motivations, and unconscious behaviors. Authentic shadow work involves recognizing how you manipulate, control, blame, or harm others, even when unconscious or seemingly justified. It means examining your capacity for cruelty, selfishness, jealousy, and destruction, and learning to channel these energies constructively rather than acting them out. Jung emphasized that this isn't about suppressing shadow content or expressing every impulse. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, he wrote, "The goal is not to overcome the shadow, but to consciously realize it." This develops what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing forces in creative tension, being capable of both kindness and cruelty, gentleness and fierceness, selflessness and self-advocacy, and choosing consciously which to express based on what serves the highest good. Clinical outcomes from Jungian analysis documented by analyst Anthony Stevens in Jung, A Very Short Introduction, 2001, typically include increased emotional regulation, more authentic relationships, greater creative vitality, and what Jung called the realization of the self, connection to something larger than ego concerns. Dark feminine reclamation addresses cultural and spiritual healing. It involves recognizing how patriarchal conditioning has separated you from natural instincts, authentic desires, and full expression. This work examines collective patterns rather than individual psychology. Feminist therapist Laura Brown in Subversive Dialogues, 1994, documented how patriarchal systems create predictable patterns, silencing women's voices, shaming natural body wisdom, devaluing feminine ways of knowing, and punishing authentic self-advocacy. Dark feminine work involves reclaiming choice in how you express femininity, not rejecting traditionally feminine qualities, but accessing the full spectrum of feminine power, including aspects that make others uncomfortable but serve your protection and authentic expression. This might include sexual autonomy, as described by feminist sexologist Eli Coleman in Sexual Health, 1992, owning your erotic nature based on your desires rather than others' expectations. It includes emotional authenticity as documented by researcher Brené Brown in Daring Greatly, 2012, the capacity to feel and express your full emotional range without performing acceptability. It includes intuitive authority as described by feminist epistemologist Sandra Harding in The Science Question in Feminism, 1986, trusting your inner knowing even when it contradicts external authorities. And it includes what psychologist Harriet Lerner called the power of anger in The Dance of Anger, 1985, using anger as information about boundary violations rather than suppressing it to maintain relationships. Both processes support each other when approached with discernment. Shadow work provides the psychological foundation for healthy dark feminine expression. When you've integrated your capacity for harm and developed conscious choice around destructive impulses, you're less likely to express feminine power in ways that damage yourself or others. Dark feminine reclamation provides cultural context for shadow work. Understanding how patriarchal conditioning shaped your self-rejection helps you reclaim suppressed aspects more consciously. Some of your shadow material might actually be healthy feminine power that was punished or shamed, but they remain distinct processes requiring different approaches and timelines. Shadow work often requires therapeutic support because of the intense emotional charge carried by unconscious material. Dark feminine reclamation might involve study of feminist theory, goddess traditions, or cultural criticism to understand the collective patterns being healed. Authentic integration manifests as increased capacity for conscious choice. You can say no clearly without attacking. You can express anger as information about boundaries without abusing others emotionally. You can be sexually autonomous without performing for validation or using sexuality as manipulation. You can be fierce in protection without being cruel in relationship. You can destroy what doesn't serve you without destroying others in the process. You can claim your power without requiring others to be powerless. As Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, the individual has always been the source of the new, the carrier of the creative spark. When both shadow integration and feminine reclamation are approached authentically, they serve not just personal healing, but collective transformation. In an age of social media spirituality and performed transformation, the depth this work requires has become countercultural. Psychiatrist Carl Jung observed in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, 1933, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but this requires moving beyond the performance of becoming. Most will choose the quicker path. The aesthetic changes, the dramatic declarations, the spiritual bypassing disguised as empowerment. They'll post quotes about being done being nice, while never examining the family dynamics that created people-pleasing patterns. They'll claim to be embracing their shadow while projecting unhealed material onto everyone around them." But as trauma researcher Peter Levine documented in Waking the Tiger, 1997, authentic transformation occurs in what he called the felt sense, the body's wisdom about what's ready to be integrated. This happens on biological timelines, not social media schedules. The real work requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, the capacity to sit with discomfort without immediately acting it out or pushing it away. This develops what neuroscientist Daniel Siegel documented in Mindsight 2010 as neural integration, the brain's capacity to remain online during emotional intensity. For those drawn to genuine transformation rather than its performance, certain markers indicate authentic progress. Emotional regulation improves, as documented by researcher Lisa Feldman Barrett in How Emotions Are Made, 2017. You can feel intense emotions without being controlled by them. You can sit with discomfort without immediately trying to escape or blame others. Relationships become more authentic. As attachment researcher Sue Johnson documented in Hold Me Tight 2008, secure attachment allows for both autonomy and connection. You attract people who can handle your full range of expression, while naturally distancing from those who require you to perform limitation. Intuitive capacity strengthens. As neuroscientist Antonio Damasio documented in Descartes' Error, 1994, somatic markers provide crucial information for decision-making. You trust your body's wisdom even when it contradicts external authorities. Boundaries become clearer and easier to maintain. As researcher Brené Brown documented in Boundaries 2021, healthy boundaries protect rather than punish. You can say no without guilt while maintaining compassion for others' disappointment. Creative expression flows more freely. As psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi documented in Flow, creative states emerge when psychological blocks are removed. Integrating rejected aspects of yourself provides access to previously unavailable psychological resources. Sexual expression becomes more authentic. As sexologist Barry McCarthy documented in Sexual Desire 2012, authentic sexuality emerges from self-knowledge rather than performance. You express your erotic nature based on your own desires rather than others' expectations. This process spirals rather than ascending linearly. What appears to be regression often indicates that deeper material is becoming available for integration. But each spiral brings greater wholeness, more authentic expression, and increased capacity to serve something larger than ego concerns. This exploration reveals why precision matters in psychological and spiritual work. Your psyche knows what it needs for healing. Your inner wisdom knows how to reclaim authentic power, but only when you stop performing the work and start living it. The path requires discernment, understanding the difference between concepts that serve genuine transformation and those that enable avoidance. It requires patience with the slowness of real change, documented by neuroplasticity researchers like Norman Doidge in The Brain That Changes Itself, 2007. As the time required for neural pathways to reorganize, most importantly, it requires recognizing that authentic power isn't a performance for others. As Jung wrote in his final work, Man and His Symbols, 1964, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. If this exploration stirred recognition rather than just intellectual agreement, trust that inner knowing, the resonance itself, contains guidance about what's ready to be integrated or reclaimed. What aspect of yourself have you been performing rather than embodying? What part of your power needs integration rather than expression? Share your reflections in the comments. Genuine dialogue serves everyone's healing. For those ready to move beyond surface-level content, subscribe for explorations that honor both psychological depth and spiritual wisdom. The real work doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It begins in silence, in the willingness to face what has been rejected. For those ready, let it begin.